Hello again and welcome back. This introductory video is for Chapter 17 of the Foner textbook, Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad. Now, one thing I want to let you know before we get started into this, this one is going to be kind of a longer video for you, so do take a break if you need to in the middle. We're going to look at some really kind of harsh things that happened in the 19th century, some of the kind of the big issues that are taking place. As you've kind of seen in the last two chapters of the textbook, we're kind of setting the stage for what's happening in the United States. There is a lot of optimism. This industrialization process that's going in the United States really makes a lot of Americans very proud to be an American, feel very confident about themselves, really get a sense that the future is going to be a great one for this country. But this chapter, we're going to focus on some of the undercurrents, some of the issues that are kind of lying there, waiting to be kind of taken care of. We've already seen some allusions to them in the last couple of chapters. This chapter kind of brings a lot of that home. Not everything. We're going to look at more of them in the next chapter as well. But this chapter does have a lot of things that we have to kind of take a look at, acknowledge it's happening in 19th century America. So kind of be prepared for that. I'm also going to show you some rather graphic images as we get closer to the end of this particular video. So please, I'll warn you about that, but please kind of keep that in mind that we need to look at these kind of difficult topics and look at some rather gruesome images sometimes to really get a sense of what's happening in the United States in the 19th century during this thing called the Gilded Age. All right, so once again, I'll warn you before we get to that point. Okay, so let's kind of do some recap here, right? This chapter still deals with this thing called the Gilded Age, and that term comes from a humorist, a writer of the period of the 19th century, an American from the South named Mark Twain. A really kind of a famous American, travels most of the entire country, goes from the Northeast all the way out to the West. He's going to live and work in places like Reno and other parts of gold country during the gold rush or the late 19th century here in California and Nevada. So he's really somebody that got to know the country quite well. And he became a humorist, remarked on a lot of things that were happening in the United States, but he also looked at some of the darker aspects of what was going on in this country. And one of the things he noticed in the 19th century is that everything looked good on the outside. This fabulous industrialization that was taking place created a huge, immense amounts of wealth for people like John Rockefeller, whose mansion's in the upper right-hand corner here, for railroad tycoons like Leland Stanford, whose mansion in Sacramento is on the lower right-hand side. So you could look at these individuals and say, wow, look at what we can produce in this country. Look how fantastically fast we're growing, how much wealth is being produced, given out, right? But Twain also noticed that that was just kind of the surface. That only happened for some. It allowed some people to become very wealthy, very privileged, but it allowed a lot of people to not ever get there. Right? The system did have a lot of inequalities in it, and not just in money terms, right? And not just in financial terms, but socially, politically, a lot of other ways. This country was becoming stratified, separated, segregated is another way to look at it. Now, Americans tended to look past this, right? Kind of focused on the shiny exterior of the Gilded Age, because Americans are kind of individualistic. They like to think of themselves as taking care of themselves, as doing things themselves, and we still do that today, right? Most of us are going to say that we take care of ourselves, and we like the idea that anybody in the United States could start with nothing and become something, and indeed it did happen. There were many cases of this happening in the Gilded Age. So this idea of the American dream becomes part of the American psyche, this idea that we can do it, that there's really nothing that can't be done, right? That there's a very go-get-em kind of attitude in the United States. But at the same time, while Americans are becoming fabulously wealthy in some cases, getting ever more wealth, ever more power to go along with that wealth, Americans are living in a different world. Up and through the 19th century, anywhere from 25 to 35,000 people a year lost their lives in the workplace. And this is in a population that's much smaller than today's America. Back in the 19th century, America went from 30 million to about 100 million people. So the population tripled during that 50, 60 years of the second half of the 19th century. Today we have 300 million Americans working and living in the United States, and our workplace deaths, things that happen because of industrial accidents or job-related accidents, is only a fraction of what happened in the 1900s with a much smaller percentage of a population, right? So kind of keep these things in mind. A lot of Americans get killed and hurt at their jobs, which makes it impossible for them to continue to work. Who's going to take care of them? There are no social services back then. They're on their own, right? Rugged individualism. Take care of yourself. Well, now that you can't work, who's going to take care of you? What do you have to do to survive, right? These are some big issues. And it's not just people working, sometimes just traveling. 200,000 people a year are going to be injured, a few thousand killed in railroad accidents, the most common form of transport in the United States. So there's a lot of ways to get hurt, to get maimed, to get killed in this country during this time. And on top of that, your job isn't always guaranteed. One day you could go to work, be getting paid a good salary, and go back the next day and find your business has closed up. It's now gone. No warning, right? That still happens today in some cases, but back then it could happen to tens of thousands of employees in a single day. So it's a very precarious situation. And not only that, sometimes you could leave and go to work your 12-hour day. So imagine that. You get up at 6 a.m., come home at 6 p.m., right? And you could come home and find out that your house burned down while you were gone. Cities like Chicago, largely made out of wood, are going to burn several times. There's going to be a large fire in 1871 that's going to destroy about half the city and about a third of the city's entire value, right? The value of the things in the city is going to be gone because of this fire. It's going to happen again about a decade and a half later in the 1880s, where almost the entire city of Chicago in the Great Fire is going to be destroyed. So there's some very big issues going on here. It's a very precarious place to live in 19th century America, right? There's no guarantees really. And life, as they say sometimes, is cheap, right? A lot of people are going to die, and they're going to be replaced by other people coming to get those jobs. So it's a kind of a rough place to live in 19th century Gilded Age America. As you can see by this picture, there's also not just the fact that you could get killed at your workplace, you could lose your job at any time, your house could burn down at any time. If you organized, like in the 1870s when industrial workers, especially railroad workers, fought back against pay cuts when their companies were offering less and less money, sometimes multiple pay cuts in 6 months. They would organize and fight back. Violence would ensue as they try to make sure that people don't take their jobs, that industrial owners, the people that ran these corporations, understood that they were upset and they wanted either the same pay or more pay. And sometimes these owners, in an attempt to kind of break these groups, these unions, these concerns of labor workers, would actually rely on the federal government to come in and break those strikes, to tell workers either go back to work, stop the violence, or we're going to shoot you. So in this period of what's called laissez-faire capitalism, when the market's supposed to just do what it does on its own, when workers and owners are supposed to get together and figure out, what's best for all of them, not a lot of this is happening. Right? The market isn't really kind of working itself out. Owners rely on the federal government's use of force. Workers use mass numbers to try and get their way. And what happens a lot of times is what happens in this picture. Violence breaks out, and then in the midst of this violence, you're going to see in the lower right-hand corner here, in this area right here, also over here on the left by these troops, you're going to see kind of middle-class Americans, urban Americans, are going to feel like they're caught in the middle of this violence, that this war that's going on between capitalist owners of industry and their workers is sometimes spilling over and affecting people that really aren't tied immediately to this process. So that both sides, industrialists and workers, are often seen as part of the problem by a lot of Americans. So again, a lot of things happening in the 19th century, a lot of strife happening in American society, not just in some areas, but eventually Americans are going to come to see that there's a lot of problems in all parts of American life. Now, one of the reasons why workers are going to be so upset, are going to organize strikes like the Great Strike in 1877, which is also the first national strike, the first strike that happens virtually across the continent of the United States, is because a lot of workers, while they seem to be doing well on the surface, much like Gilded Age America, it looks good on the outside, the inside, the reality of the situation is much different. And the best place to see this happen in is a thing called the company town. Now, this was kind of a ubiquitous institution that existed in almost all these large industrial centers in the United States. Industrialists would open up a manufacturing center, like a Carnegie steel mill or a Rockefeller refinery, and then they would house their workers nearby so their workers were accessible and could get to and from work quickly and easily. So the Owners of these companies would provide a place for the workers to live, provide a place for their children to go to school, even sometimes stores where the employees could go and buy food. The best example of this is a thing called the Pullman Town outside of Chicago, Illinois, where George Pullman, a famous railroad engineer, person that designed railroad cars that were so good, that were so well liked in American railroad industry, that they actually became 95% of all train cars used in the United States were built by George Pullman's company. Some of these Pullman cars are still in use overseas in places like Thailand and India to this day. They're that well made that 100 years later they're still going, right? So to do this, to make these fabulous railroad cars, Pullman created his own industrial complex outside of Chicago. And he hired workers and he housed those workers there. He built houses for them, built schools, libraries, churches, everything they would need to live and work for him. And he paid them a good wage. If you were a Pullman worker, you could make $1.30 a day, even if you didn't really have any skills. You were just somebody that kind of used your brute labor to move things around, right? If you did have a skilled job, where like an iron worker or a mason or some other kind of fine technical skill, you could make good money, up to $72 a month, which at that time was really good. $400 to $500 was kind of a living wage. So if you were making $700, $800 a year, you were doing pretty well. But here's kind of the issue. If you were one of Pullman's workers, you did get a good amount of money per month, but then he charged you rent to live in one of his houses. You had to pay for the water, right? The ability to actually drink water in your house, much like we do today. If you wanted gas for lighting, you had to pay for that. If you wanted access to the library in town, you had to pay for that. If you had children that used the library, you had to pay for them to use the library. If you wanted to go to church, your church would have to pay for the use of that building, which meant that the congregation, the workers that were using the church, had to pay for the use of that church. So everything was paid for. So when you really got down to it, Pullman got most of his money back that he paid his workers. And when he would do things like cut their wages, it meant that now, sometimes, they weren't even making money each month. They were losing money by working for Pullman. They could come out of a month owing more than they made working for him because he didn't lower his costs when he cut their pay. So this leads to a lot of strife, a lot of problems. The 1894 Pullman strike is going to be a vicious one. But you can kind of see these workers had in this piece by a labor writer of the Gilded Age, Sidney Lenz, who was in the Chicago area and wrote on a lot of this worker strife, that a kind of a labor strife that occurred in the Chicago area in the 1890s. And when he talked to some of Pullman's workers, they kind of gave him a sense of how they felt about this situation. And he wrote down that 5,500 workers lived in Pullman's tenements, worked in their shops, prayed at his churches rented from him, sent their children to schools built by him, relaxed in his park, and, as one worker put it, were buried in the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell. In a lot of ways, these workers were saying that they just felt completely controlled at this person's beck and call in a lot of ways, that even in death they may not be able to escape him and his power and influence. So you can see, if you were at the top of this Gilded Age America, you had an incredible amount of power and influence over people. If you were at the bottom of this pyramid, things weren't always that good for you. They could be, but they didn't have to be. And certainly, as we can see from some of the statistics I've shown you, a lot of times things weren't that good for you. And that's not the only issues going on in Gilded Age America. There's also issues for farmers, right? Labor workers, industrial workers have their issues with Gilded Age America. Farmers are as well. Now, farmers often called themselves grangers, a lot of different names for themselves. Some of their movements were called grange movements. Eventually, they're going to be called populists during this period of the Gilded Age. And a lot of these American farmers, especially out in the West, but also in the Midwest and the South, they also felt kind of victimized by this industrialized America. Often kind of pointing out that the railroad companies that had massive amounts of land given to them to build the railroads across the United States then sold that land very cheaply to farmers like themselves. And then once they started growing their crops, they started charging more and more and more for their freight prices to move those crops. The only way those farmers were going to make money was by selling those crops. And more of their profits ended up going to the railroads. Also, they had problems as they needed to get loans to pay for equipment or to pay for fertilizers and seed and everything else they needed to run a modern farming operation. They found themselves paying ever higher credit rates. So imagine kind of running a farm on a credit card. That's the kind of interest rates these farmers in the West especially would be paying, sometimes up to 30% interest. So if they needed to buy a piece of agricultural equipment, order it from someplace in Chicago and have it delivered by freight, it would be a very expensive piece of equipment, something that most farmers actually couldn't afford. They would have to actually pull their assets together. Many farmers kind of pull together to kind of be able to afford something as expensive as a reaper, a McCormick reaper, or maybe even a new plow. So these farmers really felt victimized, much like industrial workers did. They felt that they were kind of being taken advantage of by these new corporations, by these large-scale industrial interests like banks, like railroads, like these manufacturing centers. So they started to organize themselves, started to kind of try and fight back, saying that, hey, look, it's because of me that the railroad has something to ship on its trains. It's because of me that banks have somebody to loan money to and get interest from. As this one picture here on this screen kind of depicts, a lot of these farmers felt that they were really the ones that were kind of the backbone of the American economy, and that without them that economy would fail. In some ways they're right. What were those industrial workers going to do if these farmers aren't growing food for them? Right? What are the railroads going to ship if these farmers aren't there to ship things? So what they kind of all lose sight of is that they need each other, right? So in this period of Gilded Age America, you see these divisions really kind of creeping into America, right? Really kind of tearing things down. And this farmers movement, this Grange movement that happens in the late 19th century, it really kind of sets the stage for what's going to come later on, that a lot of Americans are going to feel that the system is somehow broken and needs to be fixed. The farmers, these Grangers, are going to come up with their ideas on how to fix the situation. Ultimately, they're going to fail. They're not going to be able to push their agenda across themselves, but it will be picked up by others. And eventually, everything that these guys want is going to kind of come to fruition, that they're going to get what they want in the end. So how these farmers start trying to organize themselves is first in kind of loose organizations, kind of local organizations, where farmers would build what are called cooperatives, kind of working together, trying to help each other out. Remember, they're going to be spread out on 150, 200-acre farms, so they're not going to be right next door to each other. They're going to have to travel back and forth to see each other. So what they're going to do is kind of create social events where they can get together, talk about what they're doing, kind of work out together. It's like, if we all pull our money together, can we buy something that we all could really use and then take turns sharing it? Those kind of things. That's what the cooperative movement is about. We still have those in the Fresno area today, actually. A lot of cotton cooperatives still exist, raisin cooperatives still exist, where farmers still work together to try and control pricing and also for some needed infrastructure as well. But eventually these cooperatives get so big, have so many members, that they start getting bigger in scale, getting beyond just the local area where these farmers are, and start working together with other cooperatives in areas. And the first place where this kind of happens is in Texas in the 1870s. And eventually they're going to establish a thing called the Farmers Alliance. And the first one is the Texas Farmers Alliance, right? That's why it has the number 1 here on this flag right here, right? But you can kind of see the issues for them, what these alliances really stood for, that they were trying to do the most good for the most people, right? That this was about justice, about moderation, free trade, not being controlled by these big industrial entities that were slowly but surely controlling more and more of their lives. So this alliance movement got bigger, became a political entity as well. As your textbook kind of mentioned, they start pushing forward demands. They organize their own political party. They try to make changes that benefit them. And slowly but surely, they become a political force in the United States. Eventually, their message is going to be co-opted by the Democratic Party in the 1892 and then again in the 1896 elections. Democrats are going to kind of come in and agree, yes, that's what we believe in, and then kind of do what they want to do for themselves. But eventually, their political message, this message of the alliances, of these farmers, what's called the populist movement, does permeate American politics. It does become kind of front and center, the things that they want. And you can kind of see that some of the things that these farmers do, these meetings, these cooperatives that they build, these ways that they kind of reinforce each other, help each other, kind of work together to kind of solve their problems, still exist with us today. These farmers, when they would have their meetings, they would have picnics, bring the whole families together, make them big social events. They would hand out prizes to each other to say, hey, you did a great job growing this particular piece of produce. Maybe we should all grow it like you do. They would bring in lecturers to tell them how to do their job the best way. And we still do something like that today. There's still some vestiges of this alliance movement, these farmers' movements of the 19th century, and things like our own county fair systems, where if you still go into the agricultural buildings, they still give prizes for the best grapes, the best peaches, the best produce that are grown, right? So a lot of this movement that starts in the 1880s, 1890s is still with us today in some form or another. What we really see is that while the farmers do make an impact, they do get their political message out there, a lot of Americans still resist it. Things like their increased money supply, things like lower rate on interest rates, lower freight rates, nationalization of railroads and big utilities, right, seem to go against this American credo of individualism, of taking care of yourself, of allowing opportunity, allowing people to kind of make it what they want of themselves. And as this cartoon kind of depicts, a lot of Americans saw farmers as wanting a handout, as trying to take advantage of the situation, that they wanted the taxpayers to come in and bail them out, to use modern terminology. That these people, these farmers, wanted free interest rate loans. They wanted the government to run the railroads for them, which they did. But they wanted the government to come in and regulate those railroads so they didn't charge exorbitant fees, which was becoming more and more prevalent as these railroads bought each other and became monopolistic in tendency. So there's a lot of things going on here in 1890s America. But you can see that some of these messages, things like the labor movement message, the farmers movement message, they're getting kind of lost. A lot of industrial workers just don't see themselves as tied to these same, to the farmers message. Farmers try to reach out to industrial workers, but industrial workers just see too many differences, especially because farmers want an increase in the monetary supply, which would cause inflation, which would mean industrial workers' pay would buy even fewer things, make it harder for them to survive still. So you can see why some industrial workers are going to remain kind of anti-democrat, anti-populist message, while farmers are going to try to co-opt the Democratic Party into doing what they want. So again, politically, the United States is getting divided, financially divided, right? Socially becoming divided. A lot of divisions happening in the United States in the 1890s. One particular place where the farmers movement had a lot of strength was in the South. And the South, after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, was attempting to change. It was trying to become what is called the New South, right? This more industrialized South, a more of a northern version, right, of an industrialized society. And that does happen in the 19th century. There are big industrial concerns that start up in the South, especially in the tobacco industry, in the cigarette making industry that happens in North Carolina, iron industry that pops up in places like Birmingham, Alabama. So Southern industrial output does begin to move up. Some of the effects of the Civil War start to lessen. Some Southerners are starting to make their money working in factories rather than growing food or growing cotton out on an agricultural environment, right? Railroads start connecting more and more of the South than they ever had before the Civil War. Personal income starts to recover, right? It plummeted, almost gone to nil after the Civil War. Now it starts coming back up, but it's still only reaching a fraction of what the rest of the United States is seeing. And one of the reasons is while the South tries to portray itself as a new South, a South that's more industrialized, more in tune with the rest of America, they're very different. It is still actually an agricultural America. That's why why the Farmers Alliance gets so much of its support from Southern farmers, because there are still a lot of them. Most Southerners still make their money farming. And a new type of farming concern kind of comes along, one where the farmers actually don't own their land. And it's a system called sharecropping, where farmers, both black and white, that's kind of the interesting thing about this movement. It wasn't just for some, almost all Southerners are going to be involved in this in one way or another, agree to rent land from landowners in exchange for a share of the crops, which means that these farmers don't have any money. They don't have any real assets of their own. They're going to have to rent all of these things. So imagine running a business completely renting everything from somebody else. You know that that's probably a recipe for disaster, right? You have to be really good and have really good farming years to be able to pay off all those rented items, to pay the rent on the land, the rent on the equipment, the rent on the seed, the rent on the fertilizer, everything that you possibly need. But because of the lack of wealth in the South, because there isn't that much of an industrialization process taking place, most Southerners end up in the sharecropping system. There's going to be about 5.5 million blacks sharecroppers, but also about 3.5 million white sharecroppers. So again, this is something that's going to affect all Southerners. is going to show you that this becomes a ubiquitous system, something that you can find in virtually all parts of the South, but it's especially heavy in the cotton producing regions from South Carolina to East Texas. That's where you're going to find a lot of the sharecropping. And what happens here is, like in the industrial Northeast, where industrialists really had a lot of control, here in the South, the landowners, the people renting out the land, the equipment, the fertilizer, the seeds, right? The bankers are making loans that allow sharecroppers to go and buy these things. They're the ones that are going to end up having a tremendous amount of power and control over their society. And you can see that in the sharecropper contract. Now, you can come back and read this, stop the video when you want to, but I just want to point out a few things here that I've put in bold, right? Understand that when sharecroppers, many of whom couldn't read, agreed to these contracts, they were giving up a great deal of control over their own lives to these people that they rented the land or their infrastructure from, right? As you can see in this one sample contract from 1882, the first bold here is, all work must be under my direction. So the owner of the land, the person that was actually renting out the land for a share of the crops, ultimately had all control. He could tell these sharecroppers, these people working on his land, what to do and when to do it. If they failed to follow his instructions, he took more of the crops, eventually limiting them to 2/5 of the crops that were available, which meant 3/5, 60% of it went to him, the owner of the land. He would also make sure that the croppers did exactly what he wanted when he wanted, that they couldn't do anything else unless it was approved by him. So I think you can kind of see that some of the old institutions of the South from before the Civil War are just getting reworked, reworded, if you will, and re-implemented in new ways, right? The South hasn't really changed a whole lot from 1860 to 1890. Penalties could be built into these contracts so that if the owner of the land didn't like the way croppers were doing their work, they could go about and penalize them, making sure that those guys stayed indebted to them and had to keep farming on their land for them. So this contract system worked very, very well for the owners of these contracts, the owners of the land, very poorly for sharecroppers. Eventually, most sharecroppers are going to get so far in debt that there's no way out of these contracts. They are, in essence, once again, kind of indentured servants, akin to slavery, in the fact that they just can't get out of them. And now it's not just black sharecroppers, now there are white sharecroppers that are in the same situation. So you can see that there's this stratification of American society is in some ways kind of going across race, but as we'll see, there's also a lot of racial segregation that takes place as well. Now, one of the ways that this racial segregation takes place really kind of comes to the fore is in a very famous case in the 1890s in the South, in Louisiana, a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Homer Plessy was an American Louisianan who wanted to use a railroad, actually was recruited by black activists in Louisiana to challenge some of these segregation laws that were coming into vogue in the South in the 1890s. He agreed. Now, he had a black grandmother, but other than that, he was considered white by most of his contemporaries because both of his parents were white. It was only the one grandmother that was actually African American. So when he went down to buy his ticket on this segregated train, he bought a ticket for the white cars, and he was sold this ticket and used it. When he got on board the train, however, some of the conductors, passengers, people in the area who knew his family history knew that he had a black ancestry. And they complained and said that Homer Plessy was black, even though he was only what would be considered 1/8 black. One of his 8 ancestors was black. In the end, the conductors removed him from the train and told him that he had to sit in the black car that was reserved for black passengers because he was black, even though they had sold him a ticket for the white car for white passengers. He declared that his constitutional rights were being violated and sued the railroad company. Eventually, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896, and the court comes back and says that what the train company was doing was perfectly legal as long as the facilities they were providing were separate but equal. Now, in the end, there is no mechanism for checking this. The court never asks or defines what is separate but equal. It leaves it up to the individual businesses to determine what separate but equal is. And what this does is allows all businesses across the United States to say, well, if we want to segregate, we can. We can just say that we're giving blacks an opportunity to do this in another venue, another place, and call that equal. When In reality, they're very not. What you can see in this picture down in the lower right hand or lower left hand corner, excuse me, where the drinking fountain reserved for whites is much better than that reserved for African Americans. And that is going to happen time and time again in the South. There's going to be this legal backbone to this separation in American society that happens in the South based on race. You're going to see it in things like restrooms, public restrooms, but in all facets of American life. This decision in 1896 really kind of codifies, really kind of allows, green lights this segregation that's going to take place in the South, but eventually kind of spill over into other parts of America, other areas of America as well. Things like movie theaters are going to be segregated. Things like beaches, think about that. Even outdoor spaces, things that don't have any real infrastructure, just pieces of sand, are going to be segregated. Blacks are going to be allowed to go to some, whites to another. And we can already kind of get the idea that the facilities are going to be better in one place than the other, just like we saw in the last photo. Again, this particular beach outside St. Petersburg, Florida, very rocky, very poor conditions, whereas the nicer beaches outside St. Petersburg itself, very nice white beaches, much better quality, reserved for whites only. Happen all throughout the United States eventually. These racial attitudes that get built in the South, this division in American society that happens in the South and becomes rigidly enforced, eventually spills over into other parts of the United States, even places like Detroit, Michigan, where eventually African Americans are going to move to in large numbers during and after World War I. That's going to be divided as well. This picture shows a wall in a neighborhood outside of inner Detroit, where whites were allowed to live on one side and blacks were forced to live on the other side of it. So you can see that there's quite a breakdown in American society here in this Gilded Age. There's a lot of separations happening in ways and places. And it's not reserved for just African Americans, although they probably do get the brunt of it, and we'll kind of look at that in a few minutes here. But this could be rolled out to other groups as well. Hispanic Americans are going to feel a lot of this segregation, a lot of this kind of racial injustice is going to happen, and it's going to last quite a ways. It's going to go almost from the 1890s, like what's happening in African Americans, all the way into the 1940s and 50s. A lot of places in the South, but it's also going to happen in places in the North. Like this particular sign, "We cater to the white trade only," is in an Ohio institution outside Lancaster, which is near Cincinnati, Ohio. So these things are going to happen in a lot of different places in the United States. It's going to be kind of a ubiquitous tradition, something that's going to happen very widespread throughout the. It's going to happen to a lot of groups. Hispanics are going to experience it. African Americans are going to experience it. Native Americans, as we've seen, have already experienced it, being forced into reservation systems, all throughout the United States, divested of land and really kind of control over their own lives. It's going to also happen to Asian Americans. Chinese are going to find themselves in California pushed into Chinese-only schools, like this one, the Oriental School in San Francisco near Grant Street, which is going to remain in operation all the way into the 1930s. Where only Chinese students are allowed to go. The Chinese American students aren't allowed to go to white-only schools in San Francisco. In Los Angeles, it's going to be Hispanics that are sent to Mexican-only schools and not allowed to go to white schools in places like Orange County, for example. So what you're going to see is that depending on what kind of large minority group exists in that particular region in the United States, there is segregation happening. These rigid laws that Plessy versus Ferguson allows start getting erected and enforced everywhere across the United States. And then violence is used to kind of make sure that these groups understand that they can't challenge these laws, that they can't really kind of get out from underneath them. And that really becomes kind of the core of what happens in the 19th century and on into the 20th century as well. Now, one of the ways that this is really kind of enforced is through physical violence. Now, there are a lot of other ways, laws, keeping people from being able to work and organize, right? There are a lot of different ways that this segregation that happens in American society is enforced. But probably one of the most powerful is the fact of lynching, where groups of people would go out, grab people accused of a crime, not necessarily tried already, but people that have just been accused of a crime, taking them and administering ad hoc justice by hanging them, killing them with a rope around their neck. And this is, as you're going to see from this map done by the Tuskegee Institute out of Alabama, lynchings happened pretty much everywhere in the United States. But as you can see from kind of this legend here, the amount of information down here in the key in the lower left, a lot of what's happening especially in the South, is happening to one group of people, in this case African Americans. And that's what makes their experience in the 1890s and this period called Jim Crow, or this period of segregation, so much worse than what's happening to other groups. Now we're really kind of looking at different levels of tragedy here, but we really do have to understand that especially in the South and even outside the South, in places like along the border regions, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, it is very pronounced. The amount of violence that's directed at this one group, African Americans, is unbelievable, and it's horrific many times. Now, this is where I am going to show you some pretty graphic photographs. So I just want you to be aware of that, just how this system works, right? And how it works and how people react to it. That's kind of the other big thing to look at here. So these lynchings take place kind of throughout the South. And again, this is kind of a mob justice, if you will, even though justice isn't really met out in this situation. But what would often happen is somebody in a community would be accused of a crime, usually an African American male who had either tried to vote or tried to object to some kind of white authority or challenge the system of segregation. Sometimes it would be that person's family members, so as a way to kind of intimidate them. African American men would often be challenged as having somehow attacked, assaulted, raped a white woman. That was almost always the common theme, the common element that happens in a lot of these lynchings that take place throughout the United States, but especially in the South. And once an African American man was accused of this crime, he would often be arrested, but sometimes not even arrested, sometimes just confronted by a group of angry whites who would take him out and administer justice immediately. But also times when they would actually be apprehended by local authorities, taken to the local jail. And then the white mobs would come along, crying out for justice, saying that this person did a horrendous crime and needed to be dealt with. And they would go into the jail, sweeping aside the local law enforcement, or sometimes the law enforcement would actually help aid these mobs, and they would take out these individuals and kill them without ever getting a trial, without ever evidence being presented. They would just be killed for their presumed crime. So you can kind of see that African Americans are being treated in a much different way than other population groups, right? Not that these things can't happen to others. Native Americans are going to see the same thing. Hispanics are going to see it. Chinese are going to see it. But for African Americans, it's much more systematic, and it's much more ingrained, and it's much more pervasive, and its influences are much deeper than for a lot of these other groups, what they're going to experience. And this is where I'm going to show you some of these photographs, so please get ready for this. Right? Here are two photographs of what happens during these lynchings. Again, kind of look, here are the mobs, here are these groups. Your textbook has another picture from Texas, I want to say in the 1920s, of one individual being lynched, right? And 10,000 people show up to it. Well, sometimes they're much smaller affairs. The communities are much smaller. Like this in Clanton, Alabama on the right in the 1890s. A group of people come out to deal justice to an African American man who's been accused of attacking a white woman. Before he's ever put on trial, they grab him from the local jail, put a noose around his neck, and hang him from a nearby tree. But here's the kind of the important thing, right? Not only the loss of life, not only the fact that justice actually isn't being served, but look who's there. You're going to see a lot of white faces, but importantly, look at some of the ages of these participants. You can see this really well in the other picture on the right, that of the killing of Lidge Daniels in Texas, in Central Texas, in 1920. So again, this process is going to go on for several decades. This isn't something that just happened for a few days or a few years in American society. This becomes an institution, these lynchings. It's a way to kind of tell African Americans, you do not have power, you do not have authority. And look at what's happening here, right? White men come out to kind of tell African American men, you don't have any power, you don't have any authority, we can do whatever we want. And look who's there learning these things from them. Look at the young boy right here, maybe 12, 14 years old. Look at his face, right? He's actually enjoying this, right? Now, kids often will smile before a camera no matter what. But just think about that, right? The loss of this person's life, Lidge Daniels' life, means nothing to this young white boy. It is the pageantry. It's all these other things. This group meeting of the community. That's what he cares about. The fact that somebody's lost their life, no big deal to him. Another thing I want you to kind of realize about these, while these are horrific accidents, imagine this. Both of these things, both of these photos, are actually what are called postcards. They're photographs that we put on cardboard stock and then sold in stores where people could buy them, write messages on the back, which was blank, to their family members in other places, and then mail them to them. And you could find postcards like this of lynchings throughout the United States in various places in the South all the way up into the 1960s. So this wasn't, again, something that just happened for a few years. This became an institution. It became a way of doing things in the South, especially in that Jim Crow segregated South. It was a way to tell African Americans that what their place was and when they were stepping out of that place, when they were trying to challenge white authority. And this is what would often happen to them when they did try to challenge, or even if it was a perceived challenge. And this is going to go all the way up into the 1950s and 60s. Actually, the last known lynching of an African American by a racial hate group, if you will, by the KKK, one of these institutions, the Ku Klux Klan, one of these institutions to kind of defend this segregated society, happened in 1981 in Alabama. So this is a long-lasting, pervasive element in American society, and it really does affect the way the country functions. So you can see there's a lot of underlying problems here. Now we're going to kind of up here. And I want you to understand that there's a lot of issues in Gilded Age America, issues that a lot of Americans really aren't trying to deal with. There's this labor strife between industrialists and their workers. Industrialists want to, of course, pay as little as possible. Workers, of course, want better working conditions where they don't die and better pay. There's job security issues, right? One day you have a job, the next you don't. Makes for a very precarious situation in your personal life. Your living conditions are pretty bad. We're going to look at that even more depth next chapter, but you've already seen the fact that a lot of industrial workers, a lot of urban dwellers are living in pretty poor conditions in the United States. And because of all these issues, the wealth gap, the education gap, all these different things that are happening, America becomes more and more segregated society, both socially, because of your wealth, politically, again, maybe because of your wealth, but also racially. So there's almost no area of Gilded Age America that isn't somehow separated, isn't kind of broken down into the haves and have-nots. And these problems are going to have to be addressed. And as a matter of fact, a group of Americans are going to kind of step forward in the early 1900s and say these problems have to end. But maybe not all of these problems. It's going to be interesting to see which ones they choose to fix and why. And that's what we'll kind of look at in the next chapter. So thanks again for hanging in there and kind of going through all this. I know it was a lot, but hopefully you kind of, between this and the PowerPoint lecture, you'll kind of see just what is going on in Gilded Age America. Thanks.